When I was just a little kid, my parents decided to split up. They were always arguing and just couldn't find a way to make things work. Now that I'm older, I get that they were just too different, and forcing a life together wasn't doing anyone any good. Instead of dragging things out through court and turning it into a big legal mess, they settled it quietly between themselves. My dad traveled a lot for work, so it made sense for me to stay with my mom, with him paying child support to help out. I didn't fully understand what was happening at the time, but when I turned 12, I finally asked my mom the big question. Why can't we all live together, like some of my friends' families? She didn't sugarcoat it. She explained it straight. I won't lie. It was tough to hear that my family wouldn't ever be the normal family I'd hoped for, but it did help me understand things a little better. Now I'm 15, and I've more or less accepted how things are. Or at least I thought I had, until my mom met someone new, Ben. She dated him quietly for a while, and now, just recently, they got engaged. I only met him a few months back, and it surprised me to learn they'd actually been together for almost a year before she introduced us. She said she'd wanted to be sure of the relationship first, to see if it was serious, before bringing me into it. They're now planning to move in together, and my mom's been trying to give me time to adjust to Ben. Honestly, Ben isn't that bad. He's pretty laid back and can even be fun sometimes. He doesn't try to push a new dad vibe on me, which I really appreciate. He's respectful and keeps things cool between us, and I'm glad for that. But then there's Jake, Ben's son. Jake is about my age, and things between us are complicated. We both started at the same high school this year because I transferred. While we technically know each other from our parents, at school it's like we're strangers. I've tried a few times to make small talk or break the ice, but he just shuts me down, every time. And it's not just with me. He's also distant with my mom. I can tell he's struggling with seeing his dad with someone else, which I get, especially since Ben's a widower. I'm sure Jake misses his own mom a lot, and maybe he feels like my mom is trying to replace her. Still, it's hard not to feel irritated. My mom's doing her best to make Jake feel welcome, always trying to include him, going out of her way to make things nice. But Jake just gives her the cold shoulder. It's tough watching her put in so much effort for someone who doesn't seem to care at all, and it's made me start resenting him. Then came the Sunday dinner that changed everything. We were all sitting at the table, trying to do the usual family dinner thing, and out of nowhere, Jake announced that he wouldn't be moving in with us. It took everyone by surprise. My mom, trying to be understanding, asked him why he felt that way. Our house is definitely bigger than theirs and closer to school, so I thought he'd be glad to move. But Jake, who's in his final year of high school and really serious about art, explained that he needs a space to work on his art. He's dead set on getting into art school, and he's been using their garage as a studio for painting and building his portfolio. If he moves, he won't have the space he needs to work on his art at home. And then, before I could even process it, my mom suggested that Jake could use my room as his art studio. Yeah, you read that right. My room. She suggested it like it was no big deal, as if I'd be perfectly fine with giving up my space for this guy who doesn't even like us. I couldn't believe it. Why should I lose my room for him? Why does he get his own bedroom and a studio while I get bumped out of my own space? I immediately told them I wasn't okay with it and that it was totally unfair. But instead of listening, my mom just shushed me and said we'd figure out my situation later. It felt like she was brushing aside my feelings to make Jake happy. I went to bed that night fuming. It hurt, realizing she'd put his needs before mine without a second thought. The next morning, I was ready to stand my ground. I was set to tell her that there was no way I'd give up my room no matter what. But before I could say anything, she started lecturing me about learning to compromise and being more helpful. She said it was only for a few months and explained that once Jake left for college, I could have my room back. Her big idea was for me to move into her home office, which is basically a cramped room with a desk and no closet. She even suggested I could use the living room and kitchen as extra space. I was speechless. How could she think it was okay to shove me into her office? Did she really think I'd be fine sleeping in her workspace and pretending the rest of the house was somehow my own? It felt like she was totally dismissing how I felt, all for someone who'd shown us nothing but disdain since day one. I wasn't about to just sit back and watch my life get flipped upside down for an entire year. especially not for someone who didn't seem to appreciate any of it. So I called my dad. Even though he and my mom weren't together anymore, he'd always made sure I was taken care of. I explained everything. How my mom was planning to kick me out of my room for Jake and stuff me into her office. He listened, and by the end of it, he was just as upset as I was. He promised he'd talk to her and help her see how unfair the whole plan was. Talking to him made me feel a lot better. It was reassuring to know he was on my side and ready to step in. All I could do now was wait and hope he'd be able to make her see reason, so I could keep my room. A few days later, I came home from school, feeling cautiously hopeful. But as soon as I stepped inside, I could tell something was off. My mom was there, waiting for me, and the moment she saw me, she just lost it. She started yelling, saying I'd gone behind her back, snitched to my dad, and blown everything out of proportion. According to her, I'd made it sound like I was being mistreated, and she accused me of making her look like a bad mom. She was furious because my dad had apparently threatened legal action to make sure I was taken care of, including having my own room. She felt I'd betrayed her, and that I'd turned what she saw as a simple family issue into a massive ordeal. I was so freaked out by her anger, by the way she was yelling, that I didn't say a word. I just turned around, ran to my room, and shut the door. I stayed there feeling confused, hurt, and alone. It's tough. I don't hate my mom. She's still my mom. But it felt like she wasn't seeing how much this whole situation was affecting me. Instead, she was bending over backward to make Jake feel comfortable, even if it meant pushing me aside. I'm stuck now, feeling like I'm just caught in the middle of her trying to please everyone but me. It's been a mess of guilt, anger, and sadness, and I honestly don't know what to do. I know she's trying to do what she thinks is best, but it feels like she's not really seeing how much it's hurting me. I'm left wondering if maybe I'm just overreacting, or if I'm wrong for feeling this way. I'm confused and feeling like I'm being pulled in 100 directions, all while trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do next. After that explosive confrontation with my mom, things at home felt tense and uncomfortable. I tried to keep my head down and avoid her, hoping she'd eventually cool off, but the atmosphere was thick, like everyone was walking on eggshells. It was exhausting. I kept replaying the whole situation in my head, wondering if I'd made a mistake by telling my dad, but deep down, I knew I'd had no other option. She hadn't listened to me when I asked for support, and I was tired of feeling like my needs didn't matter. In the following days, I just tried to get used to my new reality. My mom made it clear that she expected me to be helpful and compromise for Jake's sake, but it felt like I was the only one sacrificing anything. My clothes were now crammed into the corner of her office, and the living room had become my makeshift sleeping space. It was unsettling. I missed my own room, my own space, and I hated the way I felt like a guest in what was supposed to be my own home. To make things worse, Jake acted like he owned the place. He'd leave his art supplies lying around, cluttering up the living room and kitchen, barely bothering to clean up after himself. It felt like every corner of the house was being taken over. One day, I'd bought myself a tub of ice cream, just trying to cheer myself up a little. But when I went to grab some after dinner, I found the container completely empty. Jake had eaten all of it without even thinking to leave a bit for anyone else. It sounds small, but that was my breaking point. I went to my mom to tell her what he'd done, hoping she'd understand how much this little thing had gotten under my skin, but she just shrugged it off, telling me, "He probably didn't realize it was yours." That was her answer. No apology, no consequence for Jake, just a simple brush off. Frustrated and feeling like there was no one in my corner, I called my dad. I didn't want to keep bothering him, but I just needed someone to hear me, to understand how tough this was. As soon as he picked up, the words came pouring out, how I'd been kicked out of my room, how Jake was taking over, and how my mom seemed more focused on pleasing him than supporting me. I was upset, and by the time I finished talking, I could hear the anger in my dad's voice. He reassured me that he'd take care of things, and I felt a bit of relief knowing he had my back. But I had no idea what he was actually planning. The next day, out of nowhere, a CPS, Child Protective Services worker, showed up at our house. He asked to speak with me privately right there on our doorstep. I was confused and a little freaked out. My mom looked equally shocked and wary, but she let him speak with me and we went over everything. My living situation, how things had changed, and how I felt about it all. I answered as honestly as I could. But it felt surreal, like I was in some strange movie. When the worker finally left, my mom turned to me looking furious. She demanded to know who had called CPS, and I told her it was probably my dad. She looked at me like I'd betrayed her, like I was the bad guy for even involving him in the first place. The yelling that followed was intense. She was angry that I'd escalated things by bringing in my dad and by extension CPS, and that I'd made her look like a bad mom. I tried to explain that I'd felt cornered and had no other option, but she didn't want to hear it. Things only got worse after that. My mom took away my phone, telling me I wasn't allowed to talk to my dad or anyone else about what was happening. I felt completely isolated, cut off from the one person who was genuinely on my side. I didn't know how long she'd keep me from talking to him, but I felt like a prisoner in my own home. The only place I could find some privacy was at school. I used one of the library computers to update my dad, letting him know what was going on and how my mom had taken my phone. I wasn't sure if he'd be able to do anything, but I felt trapped and needed to reach out. A few days later, things took another turn. The same CPS worker came back, but this time he had a warrant to inspect the house properly. And to my surprise, my dad showed up with him. He looked serious, and when we had a moment to talk privately, he told me something that left me speechless. He was planning to legally adopt me so I could live with him full time. I didn't know how to react. I hadn't expected things to go this far. I thought he'd just talk to my mom and try to straighten things out. But he seemed determined, like this was the only way to make sure I was being treated fairly. It felt strange because on one hand, I was relieved that he cared so much, but on the other, the idea of moving in with him didn't feel as easy as it sounded. My dad travels a lot for work, and I'd often have to stay alone if I moved in with him. It wasn't like I hadn't been on my own before, but this would be different. It would be all the time, and his place was far from my school. If I moved, it'd mean changing schools and uprooting my whole life just when I'd finally gotten settled. I tried explaining all this to my dad, telling him that while things weren't perfect, I was managing. I didn't want to be yanked out of everything familiar, but he seemed set on the idea. He explained that with CPS involved, he couldn't just ignore it, he had to follow through. He told me he was only doing it to protect me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control, moving forward without any say from me. Now, I feel stuck in this impossible situation. My dad's trying to rescue me, but at the cost of tearing me away from my life here. I don't want to be taken away from everything I know, even if living with my mom and Jake is tough. I keep hoping that things will just settle down, that maybe my mom will see how unfair this has been, and let me move back into my room. But I'm bracing myself for whatever comes next, unsure of what the future will hold. After the whole CPS ordeal, things went from tense to explosive at home. My mom didn't let up on the rules, and I was still cut off from talking to my dad. I felt stranded, like I was in the middle of some power struggle that had spun way out of control. I'd wanted to feel seen and supported, but now it seemed like everyone was treating me as a problem that needed solving, rather than just a kid needing a bit of understanding. Then one evening, my mom called me into the kitchen. She told me CPS had closed their case, determining there was no abuse or neglect in our home. I felt relieved, but I also saw the hurt in her eyes as she told me how hard the whole thing had been for her. She said she couldn't believe I'd taken things so far and made everything so complicated. She was upset that my dad had stepped in and made it a bigger issue than it needed to be. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I hadn't intended for things to go this far, but I knew she wouldn't listen. My mom made it clear that from her point of view, I'd betrayed her, and the more I tried to explain, the worse things got. I finally gave up, went back to my makeshift space in her office, and just sat there feeling trapped and small. It hurt knowing that despite everything, she still saw me as the one who'd crossed the line. At school, things weren't much better. Jake seemed to sense that I was at a low point and started amplifying his rude behavior. He'd make little jabs here and there, eye rolls, muttered insults, and his constant cold attitude. I tried my best to ignore him, but it felt like he enjoyed pushing my buttons, knowing he had his dad and my mom wrapped around his finger. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I confronted Jake after class, hoping we could at least talk things out and maybe clear the air. I told him that this situation was hard for me too, that I wasn't the enemy, and that we were both stuck in this weird blended family situation whether we liked it or not. But he just stared at me, smirked, and said, "That's your problem, not mine." Then he walked away. That comment stung more than I wanted to admit. I was exhausted from fighting this uphill battle at home and school, only to get the same wall of indifference from everyone around me. Every day I felt more invisible, like I was being erased from my own life. Then, as if things couldn't get any worse, Jake's behavior escalated. He started spreading rumors about me at school. He told people I had a crush on one of the popular guys in our grade, and the rumors spread like wildfire. I could feel people looking at me, whispering, and it made me feel humiliated, exposed, and completely alone. Even the guy in question started acting weird around me, giving me side glances in the halls that made my skin crawl. I went home that day, feeling lower than ever. I just wanted to crawl into bed and shut out the world, but of course I didn't even have my own room to escape to. The frustration and sadness bubbled up until eventually I couldn't hold it in anymore. I broke down, crying in that cramped little office space, wondering if things would ever feel normal again. That evening, I mustered up the courage to talk to my mom. I needed her to see what was happening and to understand just how badly this whole situation was affecting me. I told her about the rumors, the way Jake was treating me, how uncomfortable I felt at school, and how I just wanted to feel safe and supported. I hoped she'd understand, that she'd at least acknowledge how hard this was for me. But instead, she just gave me this exasperated look and said, "Kids go through these things. You and Jake will figure it out, Dot." That was it. No help, no comfort. She even went on to say that Jake was probably acting out because of all the changes and that I needed to be patient with him. I felt a mix of anger and sadness so strong I couldn't speak. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that I'd been more than patient, that I'd tried everything, and that Jake was the one who had zero interest in making things better. But I held it in, swallowed my words, and nodded along, realizing that I was on my own. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if things would ever get better. Part of me wanted to just give up, to accept that I'd have to keep my head down and wait until I could leave this house for good. But another part of me was tired of always being the one to compromise. I'd tried so hard to be understanding, to make things work, and all it had gotten me was a cramped office space and a cold shoulder from my mom. Finally, I realized that I couldn't keep doing this alone. So the next day, I found a teacher at school I trusted and told her what was going on. I didn't go into all the details, but I let her know about the rumors, the bullying, and how much it was affecting me. She listened, really listened, and for the first time in a while, I felt a glimmer of hope. She told me she'd talk to the school counselor and see what support they could offer, whether it was addressing the bullying directly or just giving me a safe space to be myself. The counselor arranged a few sessions with me, helping me work through my frustration and stress. It didn't fix everything, but having that outlet gave me a bit of strength. With their help, I started setting small boundaries with Jake, keeping my distance and not engaging with his comments or behavior. I focused on myself and slowly began rebuilding my confidence. The rumors died down eventually, and while things were still tense at home, I felt a little more grounded. I realized that, as hard as it was, I couldn't change my mom's mind or force Jake to respect me. But I could take care of myself, set boundaries, and hold on to who I was without letting their actions define me. With some distance, I was finally able to focus on things I enjoyed again, without letting Jake's behavior or my mom's constant appeasement get to me. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. The small victories, like setting boundaries with Jake and having a supportive teacher and counselor, gave me a little confidence back, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Then, unexpectedly, things took another turn. After a few quiet weeks, my mom called me into the kitchen one evening. She looked hesitant, almost nervous, like she was about to say something big. I braced myself, hoping it wouldn't be another sacrifice she needed me to make. "Dot," I quote, "Vi been thinking about everything that's happened," she said, her voice soft. "I know I haven't been as supportive as I should have been. I wanted Jake to feel at home here, but I realize now that it came at the cost of your comfort and happiness. I'm sorry." I was caught off guard. I'd been waiting so long to hear those words, but when they came, I didn't know how to respond, my mom went on, saying she saw how tough things had become for me and that she wanted to make it right. She even admitted she'd been blind to how much pressure she'd put on me to make everything work with Jake without really seeing how it was impacting me. She offered to set up a new room arrangement. I'd get my room back, and we'd set up a space for Jake somewhere else. It felt surreal, almost like I'd imagined the whole thing. I wasn't sure if things would actually change, but hearing her acknowledge what I'd been going through made me feel like I'd finally broken through. Jake's reaction, of course, was less than thrilled. He threw a bit of a fit over losing the art studio, but this time my mom held her ground. She explained that I needed my own space and that we'd all have to compromise a bit to make things work. She even asked him to be more respectful toward me, pointing out that we were all dealing with changes. For the first time, I felt like my mom was truly on my side, standing up for my needs without trying to appease Jake at my expense. It wasn't perfect. Jake still kept his distance, and while the bullying at school had stopped, he wasn't exactly warm to me at home. But I noticed a difference. He wasn't taking over the common spaces, and he didn't mess with my stuff anymore. I had my room back, my space to retreat to when things got tense, and it made all the difference. Over time, my mom and I started to rebuild our relationship. She didn't try to justify her past actions. Instead, she listened to me, letting me express how tough it had been and how much I'd needed her support. Slowly, we found our rhythm again, and I started to feel the weight lift. We even worked out a few family activities, nothing fancy, just small things like game nights or going out for dinner together. It wasn't like everything magically fell into place, but it was a start. One day, my mom and I had a heart-to-heart. She apologized for not stepping in sooner and for putting so much pressure on me to keep the peace when she should have been doing that herself. She admitted that she'd been so focused on making things work with Ben and Jake that she'd overlooked how it was affecting me. That conversation was a turning point. I could see she genuinely regretted how things had gone down and wanted to make it right. Ben, to his credit, also made an effort. He wasn't a perfect father figure, but he'd try to include me in things, whether it was inviting me along for errands or making small talk when we crossed paths at home. He didn't force anything, and I appreciated that. He also seemed to understand that things would take time, which made it easier for me to warm up to him at my own pace. As for Jake, there was an unspoken truce between us. We didn't exactly become friends, but we learned to coexist. He respected my space, and I respected his, and while we didn't talk much, we could pass each other in the hall without feeling the tension that had been there before. I think we both realized that we just have to accept each other, if only to keep things bearable for everyone else. Looking back, I can see that this whole experience taught me a lot, not just about standing up for myself, but about setting boundaries and learning to ask for what I need. I know now that I have a voice and that I don't need to shrink myself to keep the peace. I've learned that sometimes holding your ground and saying what you need to say can be uncomfortable, but it's also the only way to make real change. And while things aren't perfect, I feel hopeful about the future. My mom and I are closer now, and I know that if I ever feel like my needs aren't being met, I can speak up without fear. I'm grateful for my dad, too. He's been my rock throughout all of this, and I know he'd do anything to make sure I'm okay. As for Jake, we may never be close, but I've accepted that we're just different people. And that's okay. He has his life, his art, and I have mine. We don't have to be best friends to respect each other's space. And honestly, that's enough for me. So here's to moving forward one day at a time. I'm ready to write new chapters in my life, focusing on the things that make me happy and letting go of the things that don't. Thanks to everyone who's been there, who's listened and supported me through this. It means the world. Story 2. My golden siblings' wedding was paid for by their parents, ignored me. I therefore received retribution. Thus, I am the eldest child. That should have some significance, wouldn't it? There would be some, attention that would come with being the first child. I have now, however, essentially lived a master lesson in what it is like to be totally invisible. And to be honest, I've had these feelings ever when my sister was born. She is only 2 years my junior. However, it may as well be forever. She drew everyone in like a magnet right from the beginning. Family members, neighbors, and even strangers would pause to show their admiration for her. My folks loved it. They like flaunting her. And me, well, I kind of disappeared into the distance. In the grocery store, no one was stopping my parents to compliment me on my cuteness. I was there, sort of. It wasn't too horrible at first. I mean, as a child, I truly had no idea any different. I would see my sister receive all of this attention, all of the gifts she desired, and approval for practically all of her requests. She seemed to have a magical ability to connect with our parents. I would want something basic in the interim, such as a new book or maybe a tiny toy. I would also receive a lengthy sermon about not wasting money or the fact that we can't always have what we want. However, they would be giving my sister the very thing they just refused me less than 5 minutes later. I dismissed it while we were young. Children aren't very analytical. I simply reasoned that perhaps I didn't require as much dot. In any case, I was the silent child, the one who enjoyed reading, sketching, and playing alone with Legos. My parents probably didn't bother offering it to me since they thought I didn't need much care. In contrast, my sister was loud, humorous, and endearing in a way that seemed to win people over right away. She had the ability to brighten any space with her presence. I quote be the kid off to the side, hoping no one would notice me too much in the meantime. However, the distinctions became increasingly apparent as we grew older. By the time we started school, I felt as though I was my sister, my classmates, my shadow teachers, and even my parents in a strange reality. Everyone would comment on how gregarious and enjoyable she was. The fact that I worked hard and had the good grades didn't matter. I was only her sister. At school, nobody really paid much attention to it. The story was the same. She wouldn't even try to make friends. People who believed she was the best thing ever were all around her. The child in the back was me, not wanting to talk to anyone, nose deep in a book. I was perceived as strange. At first I didn't mind since I reasoned that at least I didn't have to put up with all the pretending and phony grins. However, after that, my sister became, well, harsh about it. "Can you just not be awkward for once?" she would plead. Or, you're a little awkward about dot. She seemed to find the notion that we were connected intolerable. To be honest, there were moments when I thought my parents couldn't either. At one point, my dad made a joke about how he couldn't believe our gene pools were the same. They would dismiss my refusal to attend one of her social gatherings as taunting. However, it quickly grew stale. At that point, envy wasn't even the issue. It was simply exhausting. Tired of being ignored all the time. I'm tired of being the uncomfortable person. Seeing my sister absorb all the attention like a sponge is exhausting. I could bust my ass and receive a shrug, while she could do the bare minimum and receive accolades. If I was lucky, I may get a nice job quickly. And I'll tell you, family get-togethers are the best way to solidify the neglected kid theme. It was like a parade for her the moment we walked in at these large family gatherings. You see who's here? It is the family's star. I just receive a pat on the head in the meanwhile, as if I were a devoted pet that went with them. They would hardly recognize me when I attempted to participate in talks. Everyone would listen intently, nodding and laughing as my sister described her day. People would have to go check on something in the kitchen after I spoke. To be honest, I began to detest such family gatherings. I was often reminded that I was a supporting role in someone else's life narrative, as if I were being pulled into a room. The life tale of my sister. She was also aware of it. Every time someone swooned over her, she would give me these arrogant little glances, as she was stating, "Look, here's how you do it." The cool one, the entertaining one was she. I was the silent one too, the strange one. Most of the time, we didn't even feel like sisters, more like housemates that live far away, compelled to share a room. I can recall a time when I genuinely defended myself. Sort of. We were at another of those endless family meals when I was around 14. My aunt had just done gushing over my sister's recent accomplishments, which incidentally were nothing more than her trying out for cheering or something. I thought, at last she's going to ask about me, as my aunt turned to face me. "So how does it feel to have such a popular sister?" was all she said. I lost my temper. "How does it feel to be ignored every single day?" I mumbled. My aunt gave me a really perplexed face as if I had just spoken a foreign language. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," my mother responded with a sigh. They treated my sentiments as if they were some kind of annoyance. I simply shut down even more after that. In retrospect, I realize how much I suppressed. Every time my sister performed something, she would receive encouragement from everyone. I hardly received a second look. I simply stopped sharing stuff at that time. Why even bother? You are aware. Since my family wouldn't be interested, why would I inform them about my hobbies or accomplishments? Just keeping my head down and following along was simpler. The person they wanted to speak with was my sister, the one they hoped would be successful. I was only present. Here, quote, "S the problem though. I was silent, but I wasn't blind. I witnessed the events firsthand. I also understood that I would always come in second in my own family, even if they didn't say it aloud. My parents would still regard my sister as though she were hanging stars in the sky, even though she could get away with everything. In contrast, I was simply another child. Things with my sister only continued to become worse over time. Her popularity peaked throughout her high school years. She was the queen bee, whereas I had been buried in literature and attempting to blend in. She seemed to be the main character in a high school drama with her entire group of pals, and I was only a supporting cast member. She was known to teachers. Even my parents couldn't spend a week without boasting about her, and she was invited to every party. I'm not suggesting that I was hoping for a grand celebration of my other kid, but the disparity in treatment was simply cruel. Every time she did something, like compete in a cheer competition, my parents would tell everyone about it. However, I thought, "Oh, that's nice, honey," when I returned home with consecutive A's. Not much more. I recall thinking, wow, that's 5 seconds of recognition. I really am fortunate. Afterward, there were the incidents. Man, oh man, the never-ending cycle of school functions, family get-togethers, and sporadic meals with my parents and their pals. Naturally, all of this had to do with her. I would sit there listening to the same cliched narrative over and over again about how my sister won the popularity contest at her school, or something similar. I just prodded my meal in the hopes that no one would notice. They didn't half the time. Within my own family, I was practically a ghost. My sister also thoroughly enjoyed it. Every time someone complimented her, she would give me these smug looks and flash her stupid smile. You know, everybody adores me. Knowing that there existed bias, she leaned heavily into it instead of leveling the playing field. She would inadvertently mention how much fun she had at a party, making little jabs about how I didn't fit in because I was too quiet, or explicitly stating that I wasn't welcome. She wanted me to feel and know that she was feeling better. I was really chosen for a huge scientific competition once, in my junior year. For once, I thought I would have the opportunity to do something interesting and prove to others that I wasn't simply my sister's awkward sibling, so I was rather delighted. "Oh, but that's on the same day as your sister's cheerleading performance?" I said to my parents. To their surprise, all okay. I thus inquired as to whether they could be able to attend both, or at least be considered for a while. They were truly perplexed, as if they had never considered the possibility that I would want them to come to my aid. It clicked at that moment. Items that were significant to my sister, mine is not required, assuming it didn't interfere with her goals. I knew deep down that there was no use in fighting about it, so I didn't even attempt. I couldn't sway their thoughts since they had already chosen a side. Naturally, they attended her chair event without even bothering to inquire about the outcome of my competition. The irony is that I was okay with being different, even though I recognized it. However, when your family views differences as negative, it might be difficult to accept them. I wasn't the gregarious or entertaining one. I was brilliant at other things, but I didn't make everyone laugh or light up a room when I went in. Things that no one seemed to care about because they were so dull. Prom season was the culmination of it all. My sister went all out. She booked a limo, got her hair and nails done, and wore a nice outfit. The entire thing. My folks were really upset about it. Naturally, they were ecstatic, snapping pictures and gushing over how beautiful she looked. Then there was me. I had no desire to attend prom at all. However, I brought it up to my parents out of curiosity to see how they would respond. Warning, they didn't. "Oh, honey, you're not really the type for that sort of thing, are you?" My mother responded with a giggle. It hurt, even if she wasn't mistaken. When prom night arrived, as anticipated, everything revolved on my sister when I was at home. In the other room, I could hear my mother and sister laughing as they got dressed. My father expressed his pride to her, as usual. It was similar to viewing a film. However, I wasn't on the screen. I was in the crowd. I stayed in my room and pretended not to care while reading a book. In actuality, though, I did give a damn. I was far more concerned than I wanted to acknowledge. The prom stories started the following morning. As I sat there, mute as usual, they went over every last aspect of her night over breakfast. They didn't inquire about my night or my feelings about skipping it. I felt as though I was invisible once more, as though it were the most significant event in the world. I sat there listening to my sister's amazing night. But what really annoyed me was how utterly unaware they appeared to be of how I felt about all of this. They didn't mean to be harsh, they simply failed to notice it. It was everything in harmony, just as they imagined. Their pride and delight was their lively daughter. Then there was me, the reserved person who didn't actually want or desire attention. Correct? They thought I was content to stay in the background and do my quiet things while my sister took center stage. My sister began dating this guy, who was, of course, the popular football player after prom. He was adored by my parents. My sister would pretend to be the world's queen as they invited him around and engaged in conversation as if he were already a member of the family. Of course, he didn't really notice me, but that wasn't unusual. As usual, I was only a part of the action, but he was her whole universe. The more she dated him, the greater the favoritism became. All of her actions now seemed even more spectacular since she was performing them with such a wonderful man. It was draining. It was almost impossible for me to enter a place without hearing about how amazing they were as a pair, or how they were destined to be together. I felt like the outsider looking in, and my family had become her personal cheer squad. I began to truly detest her at that point, not because she was well-liked or had friends or anything, but rather because she was aware of how I felt and didn't care. She appeared to like it, if nothing else. She enjoyed that I was aware of her status as the golden kid and the favored. "You wouldn't get it," she would say, or "You're not really into stuff like this, are you?" It was subtle, yet it was enough to make me feel insignificant and out of place whenever we were with our parents. In retrospect, I question whether my parents ever recognized how much they contributed to it. They could have thought it was simply typical sibling rivalry that we would outgrow, but it was much more than that. I felt like the backup kid and like I didn't matter for years. And I noticed that I was becoming more away from them, from her, and from everyone else the more they played into her hand. I had given up on attempting to blend in with my family by the time I reached my senior year. I was aware of my position, and I had no desire to go out of my way to receive a small token of recognition. Since studying was one of the few things I could control, I had immersed myself in my studies. Since I had good marks, I reasoned that perhaps things would improve if I could simply receive a scholarship and attend college. My sister was preparing to enroll at a nearby institution at that time. No major academic accomplishments, no scholarship. My parents just wrote the payments when she selected a school. They were completely unconcerned. As if it were no great issue to pay hundreds of dollars annually. In the meantime, I was frantically going over each scholarship application and trying to figure out how I could pay for school without going into debt. Neither of my parents ever volunteered to assist, not even once. I didn't anticipate it, but I had a hunch that they may give me some support and a helping hand. Nope, not at all. I thought, okay, maybe this is my moment, the night I received my university acceptance letter and full scholarship. I was prepared to inform them when I got home with the letter. A nice job would have been wonderful, but I wasn't expecting fireworks or anything. Rather, I was smacked with, "Oh well," which is fantastic. My mother then turned to face my sister and inquired about her supper preferences. It was as if I had just informed them that I had landed a job at the neighborhood supermarket, not a full scholarship to an elite university. At that moment, I became acutely aware that they simply didn't give a damn. Really, they didn't. My accomplishments, my diligence. It was just background noise. The focus is constantly on my sister's life, social standing, and relationship issues. And the impact that had on me is beyond words. In a manner that only I could sense, it was like receiving a quiet stomach hit. I became even more reclusive during the summer before college. The majority of my time was spent in the library or with a few pals who were aware of the situation. They simply understood it in that implicit sense, even though I didn't really explain it to them, and it was sufficient. It was tiring to be at home. Every day served as a reminder that I wasn't the favorite chosen by my family. I was really eager to get out. When August finally arrived, I had already moved out a week early. My folks hardly noticed. It seemed unreal the morning I departed for college. My mom just whispered, "Drive safely," while my dad muttered a halting good luck. They didn't even walk me out or assist me with loading the car. Not even my sister got out of bed to bid me farewell. I was the only one filling up the car with my whole life. To be honest though, it seemed somewhat appropriate. I had spent so much time alone. What were the additional few hundred miles? College was a welcome change. I was finally free to be myself without having to compare myself to her all the time. My family was unknown. Who was the favorite didn't matter to anyone. It was a great relief. I immersed myself in my coursework, joined a few clubs, and met people who genuinely appreciated me for who I was. For a while, I was so engrossed in my new life that I hardly gave my family any consideration. Maybe once a month I spoke with them. I often listened to brief check-in conversations that concluded with my sister's life in any case. I would put the phone down, listen to what they had to say, and concentrate on my own work. Before Thanksgiving break arrived, everything was going really smoothly. Going back made me feel conflicted, but I reasoned that it would only be for a few days and I could handle it. However, the partiality hit me like a ton of bricks when I came home. Almost never did my parents inquire about my classes or how I was adapting. My sister's most recent drama resumed as soon as I entered the room, something to do with a new man, a breakup, etc. In fact, my mother commented, "It's wonderful to have everyone back in one place," as though I had never truly left. It seemed as though they still just regarded me as their happy little family, the background figure, and the invisible kid. My mother then gave a lengthy speech about how pleased she was of us throughout supper. She talked endlessly about how strong my sister was after her breakup, and how she was becoming into this incredible person. She seldom spoke of me at all. As if I hadn't just spent the past few years being ignored in every manner imaginable, my dad said that it was crucial that we support one another. Although I was boiling on the inside, I sat there attempting to maintain a straight face. I stopped trying really hard with them after that. I didn't even try to interact or provide gifts when Christmas came and passed. They either didn't notice or didn't give a damn if they did. But when my few high school pals saw, one of them eventually inquired, "Is everything okay with your family?" I was taken aback since it was the first time I had ever been asked that question. I shrugged and answered, "Yeah, it's fine," without really knowing how to react. However, it wasn't. After winter break, returning to campus seemed like a breath of fresh air. I could see it now. I had had enough of trying to blend in with a family that didn't notice me. The notion that my life was suddenly entirely mine was both liberating and rather depressing. They would never realize how much their behavior had wounded me, and by then, I no longer wanted them to. As I neared the completion of my degree, I made the decision not to invite them to the graduation at all. Why ought I to? What was the point? They hadn't given a damn about anything else in my life. They weren't necessary for me there. For a few hours I pretended to be proud, but I knew that as soon as we left the ceremony, they would immediately return their attention to my sister. I invited my closest pals instead, individuals that genuinely knew me, encouraged me, and unreservedly appreciated my accomplishments. They applauded louder than everyone else when I crossed that stage. I will always remember that moment because, for once, I felt as though I was at the right place with the right people. My mother sent me a hesitant congrats after the ceremony. I didn't even try to respond. I had stopped making an attempt to attract their attention. I could care less whether they continued to idolize my sister. Now that I had my own life, I was at last in charge of it. Any meaningless compliments they might have given me were worthless compared to that revelation. In a way, it was simpler than I anticipated to leave them behind. They had already made their decisions, and I was only deciding to follow suit. It wasn't retaliation or resentment. It was simply the way things were. After I graduated, I hoped that some distance might help my connection with my family, or at the very least make it more tolerable. I was mistaken. I began to hear from them even less when I settled into my first job, which, to be honest, I was okay with. They would sometimes check in, but their conversations were quick and, as usual, packed with news concerning my sister. I was obviously only an afterthought, but what really struck me was how disconnected they were from my life. Every time I mentioned work to my mother, she would inexplicably bring up my sister's most recent experience. Here and there, she was doing a few part-time jobs, nothing major, but it seemed to my parents that she was establishing a lucrative profession. They expressed their pride in her or how hard she was working. They hardly noticed that I had recently obtained my first real job, lived alone, and paying my own bills. One day, out of the blue, I seemed to be performing a totally other function in the family that they didn't care about. My mother texted me to ask if I could join her for supper. I nearly disregarded it since it felt strangely formal, but I felt compelled to go. Perhaps they wanted to acknowledge me at last, or they had a huge change of heart. For the record, they didn't. My sister was already there when I arrived, laughing with my parents as if they had just had the best time without me. As usual, I felt like the odd one out as I sat down. They began by providing news on her life, including new friendships, career aspirations, and all of her ambitious ambitions. All I could do was sit there and wait for any indication that they were interested in what I was doing. But nothing happened, and the night continued. I had the impression that I had stumbled into someone else's family meal. I thought, here we go, as my dad finally turned to face me. They could inquire about my life, but he struck me with instead, "Your sister is putting a lot of effort into discovering her passion, you know. She is someone you should be proud of." I was laughing so hard I had to bite my tongue. Exactly what are you proud of? I had been working and earning a life for myself. They also encouraged me to be proud of her for pursuing her interests. It sounded like a perverse joke. I was at my breaking point. "Do you even know what I do for a living?" I questioned. They all looked at me as if I had just asked the most difficult question imaginable. My dad simply shrugged when my mom said something about an office job. My sister had the same arrogant look on her face that she had had when we were young. I could feel the heat rising in my body. Their clue was non-existent, not the slightest notion. Despite how awkward the quiet was, I forced myself to listen. I filled them in on my employment, including what I did, how hard I worked to get there, and the number of hours I put in. The tension I had to cope with. I finally let everything out and didn't keep anything back. They sat there in a state of mild shock, as if they had never known that I was more than just the quiet child who did what they said, and right when I thought I might have reached them at last. "You see, that's why you need to start thinking about a real career," my mother replied, glancing at my sister. I was blown away. My entire speech and everything I just stated have nothing to do with me. They used it as motivation to encourage my sister to do better. At that moment, I understood that people would never perceive me the same way they viewed her, regardless of my actions or accomplishments. The final straw was that supper. That night, I decided that I was done. The forced family get-togethers are over. I'm tired being the sister that is always being compared to others. I took the family group chat off my phone when I got home. I stopped making calls, stopped responding to texts, and simply gave up. And the depressing aspect? They appeared to be unaware. My mother called me a few weeks later, but I didn't answer. As usual, she left a voicemail concerning my sister. Something to do with the fact that she needed some help finding her way. My assistance? For years, they had neglected the child. They wanted me on her side. To be honest, that was hilarious. I spent my life saving money, working hard, and creating something for myself. I felt free for the first time from their criticism and from being ignored all the time. I felt as though I had lifted the enormous burden that had been weighing me down all my life. I felt lighter, happier, and like I could finally be myself without having to worry about what other people thought of me. However, my mother texted me on my sister's birthday. "If you could join your sister for supper on her birthday, she would be very happy. You've been missed by her. Are you missing me?" When did it start? It had been months since I last saw her. She had continued to live her best life based on my understanding. My curiosity overcame me, and I went against my better judgment. Entering that supper was like entering a time capsule. There had been no change. The same dynamics, the same family, the same sense of invisibility. The focus was being absorbed by my sister. I was only there as my folks showered her with affection. With the exception of a brief, "Oh, you made it," from my mother, they scarcely recognized me. As if I didn't exist, I sat through the supper and watched them joke and laugh. And I realized I would never be able to change this. I wasn't involved in their decision, which they had made a long time before. My mother tried to seem worried when she took me away after supper. She confided in me that she was concerned about my lack of support and how aloof I had become. For me, it was it. I informed her, looking her in the eye, that I had been taking care of myself for years without their assistance, approval, or support. Her expression turned blank as if she was incredulous at what she was hearing. I left before she had a chance to digest it. I didn't say goodbye. I just got into my car and drove. I also felt as though I owed them nothing for the first time. No apologies, no explanations, nothing. It was now obvious that I didn't need them after spending my entire life trying to fit in with their small group. Everything changed for me when I met my fiancé. I was with someone who genuinely noticed me, paid attention to me, and wanted me around for the first time in my life. He had no interest in my sister's identity or the behavior of my family. He simply accepted me as I was. I felt as though I could breathe at last. He demonstrated to me that I didn't require the acceptance of others, particularly not from a family that had always made me feel inadequate. I had never been able to establish limits on my own previously, but it was he who pushed me to do so. I would simply accept whatever my family gave me in the hopes that they might one day wake up and see me. But he made it clear to me that there was no need in waiting for them to change. "Why do you keep going out of your way for people who don't give back?" he would ask. And I was very affected by that. I became aware of the fact that I knew no one. Constant affirmation, especially from those who have never reciprocated. I was ecstatic when he proposed. This gentleman looked at me as if I were the only one in the room, and he genuinely wanted me in his life. I couldn't wait to tell others the news. However, I knew in my heart that my family would not respond the same way I did. Nevertheless, I thought I would be kind and inform them face to face. Perhaps I still harbored a tiny hope that they might surprise me, and at last exhibit genuine enthusiasm for anything in my life. I was nearly beaming when I arrived at my parents' place wearing the ring. I was anticipating anything when I broke the big news to them. However, I only received a brief, "Oh, congrats, that's good." When I informed them I had graduated or had my first job, they adopted the same tone, just casual, as if I had just told them that I had purchased new shoes. Nothing significant. Regarding the proposal, there are no queries. I have no desire to meet him anytime soon. Nothing. Then, almost as an afterthought, my mother stated, "Oh, and just so you know, we won't be able to contribute to your wedding just like that because we spent all of our savings on your sister's wedding." Even though I shouldn't have been shocked, it nonetheless came as a shock. After going all out for my sister and throwing her a lavish celebration, they were left with nothing. Not even a shred of money or other help for me. I pretended not to be bothered as I stood there nodding, but something inside of me broke. I immediately realized that I wouldn't require them for my wedding. They weren't concerned enough to stand behind me. So why should I make a special effort to engage them in what would be one of my most joyful days? I felt as like I was finally letting go of the last glimmer of hope I had been clinging to for years as I left their home. I had waited for them to acknowledge me, to truly be pleased that I would come through for me the way they had always done for my sister. However, this was it. The last straw. I wasn't asking them to my wedding, therefore they wouldn't be attending, and I felt free for the first time. After that final talk with my folks, I knew exactly what I had to do when I got home. After taking out the wedding invitations I had saved for my family, I looked at them for a minute before tearing them in two. I shredded each and every one of them until nothing remained. I had the impression that I was finally letting them go from my life, actually, in action as well as in words. I didn't need anyone there who had made me feel inadequate since this was my day. My relatives continued to inquire about wedding arrangements, venue dates, and other standard topics throughout the course of the following few weeks. I would ignore them, shift the topic, or simply provide evasive responses. Avoiding their queries was almost instinctive because they hadn't before demonstrated a sincere interest in my life. However, My sister finally learned about the wedding date via social media, as was to be anticipated. She must have notified my folks because all of a sudden I was inundated with calls and SMs. The typical small conversations such as, "Oh, so when's the big day?" began the texts. "And you didn't let us know that you had a date set?" However, the tone quickly shifted when they discovered I hadn't invited them. They were enraged and sent me guilt-ridden letters about respect and family. "We've always been there for you, and this is how you treat us," my mom said in a lengthy text message to me expressing how heartbroken they were. That statement's irony was genuinely absurd. For the first time in my life, I felt absolutely no guilt. Without considering their feelings, I was doing something only for me. They had several opportunities to support me and give me a sense of importance, and they had disregarded all of them. So I answered honestly. I informed them that just the most significant individuals had been invited, and that the wedding was tiny. I didn't mince words, didn't offer an explanation. They found it unpleasant to hear. However, it wasn't my issue. As they continued to talk about family ties and how weddings are meant to bring people together, they were attempting to guilt-trip me. They had never showed this much care for family when my happiness was at stake, so it was almost laughable. So I didn't back down. I wasn't going to allow them to take over my day so they could arrive, make a few flimsy remarks, then resume your disregard for me. When the wedding day finally came, everything went well. People who truly cared about me were all around me. Friends who had been there for me no matter what. People who genuinely noticed me and rejoiced in my joy. There was love and joy, and I felt totally at ease for the first time. Not having my family there didn't make me feel like I was missing anything at all. Actually, the day seemed much more like mine because they weren't there. I then received correspondence from a couple of distant relatives who had reportedly learned of the incident involving my parents' exclusion from the wedding. They sent me the typical message, "You need to have extended an invitation to them. You still consider them family. No sense." However, I had already made up my mind and had no regrets. My life was like this. I was also living it on my own terms for once. The wedding day exceeded my expectations in every way. It wasn't big, only my fiancé's family, a few friends, and those who have truly supported us. No forced familial allegiance, no phony smiles, no sense, just genuine delight and support. I had been quite concerned about whether or not my family would make me feel as like something was missing. But without the stress and the never-ending pressure to be good enough for them, it turns out that my worries had been in vain. On one of the most important days of my life, I was at last able to unwind and enjoy myself. However, it seems that my sister didn't like being excluded. She began bombarding my phone with missed calls and messages around 1 hour into the ceremony. She accused me of destroying the family, called me selfish, and questioned how I could do this to my own blood. I recall feeling nothing as I looked at my phone and saw her name appear. No need to justify myself, no guilt, just the peaceful, contented knowledge that I owed them nothing. I quickly returned to enjoying the day after putting my phone back in my backpack. I exchanged vows with my hubby, and I had an incredible sense of calm as I turned to face everyone who truly wanted the best for us. It was as though the burden of years of being disregarded, brushed aside, and relegated had finally been lifted. It was amazing that I put my happiness ahead of theirs. The reception was straightforward yet ideal. No extravagant decor, no tension, just delicious food, music, and fun. My best friend once made a toast and said something that really got to me. Cheers to our chosen family. Everything I had been attempting to express for years was encapsulated in that one statement. Family is more than simply blood. It's about the individuals that support you, care about you unconditionally, and treat you as though you are truly important. And the family I had chosen, and who had chosen me in return, were all around me that day. As the evening wore on, I didn't think twice about my relatives back home. I wasn't expecting they would eventually acknowledge their mistake, or waiting for an unattainable apologies. I was certain they wouldn't. I had never been seen by them. Not really. They also didn't deserve to be a part of my future if they couldn't join me in celebrating my wedding.